Welcome back to Arctic 360's Summer 2024 podcast series, Breaking the Ice. I am one of your hosts, Nazia Shah, and this season I'll be joined by Nicole and Jaden as well. Our podcast series theme is Summer of North American Maritime Security, where we delve into the big issues concerning the people and politics facing the Canadian North and the whole of the Arctic region. In today's episode, we talk about the twists and turns of Arctic maritime governance, environmental risks that come with more shipping traffic, and why better coordination in Arctic research is so crucial. We also get into how blending traditional Inuit knowledge with modern science is a game changer, but most importantly, we conclude how international collaboration and empowerment of the next generation are actually key to ensuring the Arctic has a sustainable future.
Well, let's get started.
Governance institutions and other governance mechanisms are critical to the overall architecture of North American maritime Arctic security and defense. And so to that end, I could not be more pleased to have with us today on our episode two of the region's, I argue, biggest thought leaders on this subject. We have Mead Treadwell from Alaska and Jackie Dawson joining us today from somewhere in Canada's high Arctic, where she's doing her field research. Mead's list of accolades, I would say, are many, but most relevant for today's discussion, Mead's a former Lieutenant Governor of Alaska, a former member of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. He's co-chair of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute and a very close colleague and friend of Arctic 360. Mead has also spent many years thinking about and advocating for an Arctic Seaway mechanism in the Northwest Passage. Jackie is an associate professor of geography, environment, and geomatics at the University of Ottawa. But I would say that's the least of her accomplishments. Among many others, she has been on the Canadian Council of Academies expert panels focused on marine shipping in Canada. She's a member of the College of Royal Society of Canada, a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and a co-chair for the WMO's Polar Prediction Project. And most important for today's discussion, Jackie currently leads Canada's Arctic Corridors Project. I also argue she's Canada's leading thought leader when it comes to Canadian Arctic shipping and maritime governance. So therefore, it should come as no surprise as to why I wanted to have these two experts here together for this episode. But before we get into the discussion, I want to hand it over to our co-producers so they can introduce themselves and take it away from here.
Hello everyone, my name is Nazia Shah and I'm excited to join you today from Toronto, where I'm pursuing a master's degree in global affairs at the Mung School of Global Affairs and Public Policy.
Hi, my name is Jaden Stevens, and I'm joining from my hometown in Norman Wells, Northwest Territories.
Hi, my name's Nicole Butler. I'm originally from Calgary, Alberta, but I'm calling in today from Washington, D.C. because I'm here doing my master's at Georgetown University.
Okay, so I want to set the stage by exploring the broader landscape of maritime governance in the North American Arctic. So Jackie and Mead, you have both worked tirelessly for over a decade on Arctic maritime governance issues and on specific initiatives in your respective countries. Could you give our listeners a general sense of how you would describe the current state of maritime governance in the North American Arctic?
The current state of maritime governance in the entire North American Arctic, I mean, it's extremely diverse in a sense, right? It's so multi-jurisdictional and challenging. And, we talk about the Northwest Passage, it's thousands of miles long. I should really say kilometers. It's thousands of kilometers long, and people define it in somewhat different ways depending on where where your ships are coming and going. But I would say it's challenged. That's probably the biggest word I would use. And not because we don't have regulation and not because we don't have formal mechanisms for governance, but, international law is a challenging thing. And when you have a multi-jurisdictional, arrangement, those regulations are different in different places. And of course we have the Polar Code, which came into effect, I think, Mead, was it 2011, I think is when or was it 2000? I can't remember.
No, it's more like 2015.
15, yeah. So that was great. But in many cases, for example, the Canadian regulations have more teeth, you could say, than the Polar Code. So, that had very little change, I would argue. Anyway, I'll punt it to you, Mead.
Yeah, so Jackie, I'm going to start just a little bit earlier. The first commercial use of the Northwest Passage was the Manhattan. That was a couple of test shipments by Exxon Mobil at the time, or before it was Exxon Mobil, to see if we could take Prudhoe Bay oil out of Alaska via the Northwest Passage to East Coast destinations. And we certainly proved that we could do that safely. There was a large concern raised by Canada that what the U.S. considers to be international straits were trucking right through traditional water subsistence areas, areas that Canada ultimately worked on with its regions to be domestic waters. And so the U.S. by letter basically said that for our federal vessels, and we would encourage for commercial vessels that there be consultation ahead of time. The U.S. didn't say we wouldn't use this international strait or so forth, but said we'd have cooperation. And that was among the first governance on the Northwest Passage side. I was chairman of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, came in as chair in 2006. I've been on the commission since 2001. And we funded a program for the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment of the Arctic Council. And what that program did is it, for the first time ever, got all 8 nations, Russia, Canada, the United States, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and Denmark, and basically said, here is our agenda for safety in the Arctic Ocean. And we have accomplished a large part of that agenda. We have a search and rescue agreement. We have an oil spill agreement. We have we said we would go to the IMO to go for a mandatory polar code. We have straits agreements, traffic agreements in the Bering Straits. We have what I like to say is all sorts of rules now in place that we've gone to get ready for this newly accessible ocean. What we're missing primarily is the resources. You can make rules all day long, but unless you've got icebreakers, unless you've got the ship services capability, unless you've got the forward ports, unless you've got the ACE in navigation, you're a geomatics person, so is my daughter. So I will tell you, unless you have the charting, you don't have safe, secure, and reliable shipping. I think the one other thing that is very important to remember is that we are still learning quite a bit about how to make sure that shipping, and especially shipping through ice, is not harmfully impacting marine mammals and thus subsistence use in the Arctic region. And there's a lot going on around the world about noise and marine mammals. There's a lot of new best practices on don't ramming, don't gun your engines. We have much better ice detection technologies today than we had even 20 years ago. And so the resources are coming, but slowly.
Yeah, I don't know if it's worth adding here, but I'll give you some stats on the resources from an ice baking perspective, at least in the Canadian portion of the Northwest Passage. In the 5 years between 1990 and 94, just under 50% of the vessels operating in the Canadian Arctic were highly ice strengthened. So, icebreakers, PC7s, but mostly PC3s. Now, in the period between 2015 and 2019, that percentage is less than 5% compared to the number of vessels that are operating that are non-ice strengthened or that are, very low ice strengthening. So this is a completely different operating environment, as Mead, referenced.
And your PC numbers, that's not political correctness, that's polar class.
Yes, polar class.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
But I guess I'll say this: if they're operating in not polar class, they're probably operating in basically open water. But there are other aspects of the polar code I hope they're following. For example,
I hope
I don't
so.
think I don't. The polar code says don't come into the Arctic without heated lifeboats, for example, and that's a pretty good idea.
Yeah, so I think we did some work on that too, and we found 4% of those vessels are not operating in open water. So we can do, because of geomatics now, because of satellite imagery, and because of the increased understanding of ice dynamics, we can now do this analysis. And so, we are looking at 4% of those vessels are not following polar code and are operating in regions they should not. Usually not because they want to be non-compliant, but usually it's because the wind and the ice dynamics are very challenging to work in.
Can you please tell us about the Arctic Corridors Research Project, its aim, purpose, process, and where we are today with the project?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. And this, the Arctic Corridors Northern Voices project stems from the AMSA, or the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment that was referred to earlier. And in the AMSA, it rightly stated that in order to understand the sort of shipping dynamics, in order to govern shipping in the future, we have to understand where culturally significant marine areas are. In the Canadian Arctic, there are 4 settled land claim areas. You could say that Inuit are, in some regard, are in control of, the greatest proportion of the land in our entire country. So about 40% of the land mass of our country is, we have, there's a legal and moral imperative to ensure that Inuit are involved in the governance of those spaces. And previously, we had really only identified ecologically and biologically significant areas, which is extremely important. There's the biodiversity of the Arctic is very limited, so we have to be very careful. But the culturally significant areas were not identified. So that project we started around 2014. It's still going today. And we've been mapping culturally significant marine areas all across the Canadian Arctic. And in fact, we're starting to look at doing it in Alaska as well and in Greenland. And so the way that works is we work with Inuit communities. Inuit identify hunters and key knowledge holders. We map the region in terms of where are the marine mammals, where are they seeing those significant marine mammals, where are they hunting, where are they berry picking, where are the important areas. We overlap that with some scientific information we have about marine species, and then we create these maps. We talk about where the core shipping corridor should be. So I'll give you one example that I think is one of the best ones. Coral Harbor is located, in some ways in the heart of the Northwest Passage, and there's an island right out of Coral Harbor, and the ships were most of the time going on, the Coral Harbor. So I would say the northern side of that island. Makes sense. It's a bit safer to go in between the island and the shore versus going around the sort of more open area. But that's where the walrus are. And that's where the walrus haul out is for hunting. So the community simply said, can we shift this corridor to the more southern side of that island simply so we don't disrupt these walrus, and certainly during this time period when we're engaged in walrus hunting. Ship operators, I have to say, ship operators I've worked with are very open and very willing to do that. They just need to know. So now ship operators are going to the southern side of that island, just, at particular times of year, not to disrupt that. Where we are today with that project is, you started at the University of Ottawa. We were doing all the work. We were doing all the mapping. But with, knowledge holders, now the project has more or less been handed over to Inuit organizations. We've written up methodology books and handbooks and we've trained over 60 Inuit youth and about 10 Inuit government employees. And they're now doing the work themselves. We basically help, but we're no longer leading that project, which is it's a nice outcome as a scientist to be able to hand something over to Inuit groups themselves. So that's now going on in Nunasugut.
Before we hand it over to Mead, so how is that information then relayed to the shippers, and how is that governed?
Yeah, good question. So we worked with the Canadian Hydrographic Service, who are in charge of the Arctic corridors, the low impact shipping corridors. So the government of Canada has all of those maps, all that information, and that's technically the data is owned by the community, and by Inuit, they have given permission for that information to go to the government of Canada. And that information then goes into, requests to the IMO to have, certain low impact areas or low, Mead earlier was talking about the importance of noise and underwater noise. So now all of that information is being relayed through the formal mechanisms that the federal government has and that the IMO has in order to create different mechanisms. We need low impact in this area at this time of year because narwhals are breeding. We need no anchoring over here because this is clamming season, and in this specific areas where Pond Inlet collects clams. So that's how it gets relayed. And sometimes informally, ship operators have taken it upon themselves to go to the website, which is www.arcticcorridors.ca. And there's, I think, 16 or 17 different community reports, and they themselves then go and see the maps and the requests of Inuit, hunters about where they do not want shipping or fast shipping or anchoring or what have you. So it's all mapped.
That's pretty incredible. And nice to see that it has been able to kind of transcend into like the next phase of the project. Mead, we're going to jump over to you now and get you to tell us a little bit about the projects that you've been working on, mainly the Arctic Seaway concept, which you've been a big advocate for. Given the potential for the Arctic to become a major shipping route, what lessons have been taken from the St. Lawrence Seaway, and how has the initiative evolved over time?
Sure. So let me just start by responding a little bit to Jackie on what she's talking about with our Arctic corridors. In Alaska, probably the first attempt on this has been an agreement signed by some oil companies with Native leaders in the North Slope Borough, which is called the Open Water Agreement. And the general idea is to try to restrain shipping from any impact on subsistence whaling. And that's include moratorium on certain times and so forth. And I am chairman of a project that hopes to export LNG with tankers like the Russians are. And I don't know that the open water agreement is the best course for us, but we are certainly very, very cognizant of the possibilities of impact of shipping on subsistence use. And so we're looking at building the port much further offshore, for example. There's been a port access routing study, two of them actually by the Coast Guard, one in the Bering Straits and one in the Beaufort Sea. And the argument is go straight north and just get as far away from the shore as you can, as quickly as you can, subject, of course, to ice conditions to do that. And there will be other best practices developed a number of places, including the Arctic Council's best practices group within PAIN. The second thing I would say, just on the regulations here, is that the Coast Guard right now is doing something called the Western Alaska Study on Oil Spill Standards, because after Exxon Valdez and the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, we actually had a loophole, a fairly large loophole for half of the coastline of the United States that did not set as high standards. And so we're in the process right now of trying to figure out the economics of ship services to prevent and respond to oil spills. And that could also help other ship safety, marine casualty issues. So that's a pending process going on domestically. There's also a new initiative by a government contractor called MITRE, called the Transparent Ocean Project in the Bering Sea, where we're looking at all sorts of new sensors, use of fiber optics as sensors. The technology keeps improving where you don't even have to hook up a sensor to it. It itself becomes a sensor, so that we can have much more dynamic information about what's going on, not only for security purposes, but also biologically. Where are the whales? Where are the walrus? That sort of thing. And because my sense is that even as you go through your Arctic Corridors project, Jackie, you mentioned, this is where the haulouts are, but that's a seasonal thing. And so understanding how things are changing in real time will help marine safety and reduce impacts as well.
Okay, can you tell us how this all relates to the SEAL Act put forward by Senator Murkowski?
The subject of the SEAL Act and the act which ultimately passed, which is to create a federal advisory committee to look at implementing something like the SEAL Act, is this. Um, my friend Tara Varasti from Finland described the concept as Uber for icebreakers, but let me put it another way. There are three routes trans-Arctic if the Arctic Ocean is going to be useful to global commerce, like the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. And those three routes include the Northeast Passage across the top of Russia, the Northwest Passage across the top of Canada, and transpolar routes, which are increasingly possible as ice conditions change. And the US policy that I helped write in 2009 said basically the United States wants safe, secure, and reliable Arctic shipping. And most of the response to that policy and all of the strategies and implementation plans that have come out have ignored the word reliable. And I'm just going to say this, unless you can promise reliable shipping, you're not going to have shipping that anybody wants to deal with. You're not going to have enough to pay for the infrastructure that you need, and you're not going to have good actors and so forth. So thinking about reliability is very, very important. And it's also a hard thing for, I guess I will say, environmental regulators to do. So what does reliability need? We need aids to navigation. We need ports of refuge. We need better charting. We need response vessels that can pull you out or help you in the way of ice conditions or other things. And so the concept was to create something like an Arctic Seaway Development Corporation, invite other nations to come in and work with us. There's several different ways you could organize it, but it was modeled in part after two initiatives. One is the St. Lawrence Seaway agreements that the United States and Canada have, and the other was how we developed ComSat, or communication satellites, early in the space age. In both cases, in the St. Lawrence Seaway agreements that began, there were a few early in the 20th century, but much closer agreements in the 1950s. Today, you've got seaway authorities on both sides, in both Canada and the United States. They work together to promote a seamless shipping system, whether it's the locks, whether it's the icebreakers, whether it's the inspections, whether it's the aids to navigation, and frankly, working with many different port cities on the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes to promote this as a seaway. And our nations work together on this. And so there's one number to call for a shipper to use the seaway. If you're assigned a U.S. icebreaker, you aren't required to pay because U.S. law says that comes out of port taxes. If you're assigned a Canadian icebreaker, you might be assessed a tariff. But either way, you've got a system where two nations are working together on a common seaway and common Great Lakes to offer a safe, secure, and reliable service. In the Arctic, the U.S. doesn't necessarily accept Canada's claims of sovereignty on the internal waters, but we do agree that we don't want oil spills, we don't want unsafe practices, we don't want to upset subsistence. And so the idea was also really to kind of transcend this and say, let's move forward to see what kind of regime gives us safety, security, and reliability. And that concept was maybe seasonally. We, the Finns, for example, have got lots of icebreaker capacity, which they basically only need December through March. Our ice breaking season, where you might see more ice jamming up, for example, is usually March through June or July. Annual ice is relatively easy to navigate for ice class vessels. And so the concept here was for the United States to establish a corporation and invite cooperation from other seafaring nations with Arctic capability to be able to offer perhaps a tariff-based system like the Russians have, to cover the costs of the resources needed for safety. That bill was introduced by Senator Murkowski, was considered informally by the leadership of the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee, and ultimately replaced by a bill that sets up a federal advisory committee to consider this idea and come back and report to Congress on whether this idea should happen. That bill was passed in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019. And unfortunately, even though there's been kind of very good words said by Canadian and U.S. transportation ministers, for example, that committee is yet to be established, but we are assured it's still being considered. And the governor of Alaska has asked me to serve on it as the state's rep if it comes along. I also just want to say that when you talk about nations that would benefit from secure Arctic shipping, that certainly includes Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, Singapore, European nations. I've met with the Prime Minister of Norway, past Prime Minister, and actually the current Prime Minister of Norway. There is an interest in doing this. And of course, the other big question is, what do the Russians think?
Okay, so you bring up an important point I hope we can discuss further. So in terms of the international picture, you mentioned our international Arctic neighbors. So where does Russia fit into this discussion? You know, Russia's created its own Arctic seaway regime for the Northern Sea Route. The war, of course, complicates cooperation. But ultimately, can you imagine the two seaway regimes cooperating in some manner? And what role then would the Nordic Arctic states play?
The Russians think they should have the monopoly on ship services. And I made the point that unless there's cooperation, you're not going to get the kind of reliability that people will plan on. So our concept is this: it's likely to be considered by a U.S. advisory committee, which will have about 2 years to produce a report. I'm hopeful that that gets started sometime this year. We've got a brand new staffer at the interagency group, chaired by the Department of Transportation, co-chaired by the Coast Guard, whose job is to make this happen. And ultimately, that the question is, what kind of cooperation can we do, not just to claim our rights and to say, here's what we don't want you to do, but to say, how do we go forward together? The last thing I'll say is there's been another international effort, which was recently announced, where the U.S., Canada, Finland have agreed to work together on icebreaker technology. And that's a recognition that I really have to give Finland a huge amount of credit for, working now through 3 presidencies. I remember sitting in Helsinki during the Obama years, during the Trump years, now during the Biden years, where we've gotten 3 presidents. Donald Trump had the president of Finland in his office, I think twice in his first year, to bring about cooperation on icebreaking in the Arctic. And that's actually another move that could support this general concept.
I'm going to just throw in a quick follow-up so you guys can both touch on this and then take it away. But just if either or both of you can touch on to just why this kind of sharing of icebreakers is being considered as a better solution right now than buying or building icebreakers, and why this is actually going to get things moving faster. So if you can just touch on that, but take it away.
Absolutely. Well, I love this. And I think, I mean, so many things to comment on. It's kind of exciting right now, I would say. Hey, and Mead, you've got a long history on the political side, and I've been watching as a armchair scientist, but there's a lot going on right now. And I think we might be going in a better direction, but there's a long way to go. So this agreement between Finland, Canada, and the US on building icebreakers is I would argue, monumental. It's going to be huge. We've been stagnating on this for decades. From a Canadian perspective, in the Harper years, we were promised this Diefenbaker icebreaker. It's still yet to emerge. We have 6 icebreakers, but really 5 are operational, and they're all really past due. In the US, you've got the Healy also aging. So this is exciting. And I would say I give kudos to Finland, but I also give kudos to Davy Shipbuilding, which is a company in Canada that just bought a shipyard in Helsinki. That I think this was kind of the impetus for this happening, because this allows Finnish technology, which we all know is the best in the world, to help, and then to have a Canadian, owned and, Finnish and other, internationally operated shipbuilding facility. This is going to be huge, and for the Americans to come in on that as well is it's going to change the game. And I think we're going to be able to get ships built a lot faster than we ever could before. And I love this idea of Uber for icebreakers. What a brilliant way to frame that. And I think that'll support. We've got the regulations in place, right? The joint search and rescue, the joint oil spill. We've got a lot of these regulations in place, but we don't have the resources to actually do this. So I think this is going to be monumental. I might punt it back to you, Mead, to kind of continue on that. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about what you referred earlier to the 3 different routes, because I think politically that's going to be an interesting future from a sort of climate perspective, but also from a technology perspective. So
I think there's a couple things. And in fact, Jackie, since you are into geomatics, which is charting and mapping, I was at the Stevens Arctic Security Studies Center here last week, and also participated in their joint dialogue with Canada and Nunavut, though virtually. It was in Iqaluit about a month ago, and I think it's important to understand that for ship depth, there are limitations of the Northwest Passage. There are limitations of the Northeast Passage, and transpolar is thus kind of a grail for that. The other issue is I don't get too caught up in icebreaker counts. Yeah, the Russians have got a lot of them. Well, they also have more territory and more harbors to clear, and large 14 LNG icebreaking tankers that need to be cleared in and out of port when they move, and oil moving from Verendey, and resupply and so forth. Things that we've managed to do, what they do with heavy ships, with ship bottoms, we tend in North America to do with tug and barge during open water in terms of resupply for that. You've got Mary River coming along, which will have more ore exports directly. Most of the Canadian mining in the high north, before that, you could fly the gold out in an ammo box. I mean, it was not, you had a resupply mission to bring fuel and construction materials in.
If I could just pump in a bit about resupply, though, I think this is really interesting. I agree with you completely, but things are changing. And, an apple in Pond Inlet costs, about like $7. So what we're doing with tug and barge and resupply isn't, if we want to increase population, increase sustainable, self-determined economic development, then we do need, to change the way we're doing that.
So at the risk of using a politically incorrect example, imagine wagon trains crossing the American West, where you had natural hazards, and you also had you still had attacks by bandits, and you had attacks by Indian tribes that weren't necessarily happy with people moving through. The question is, in order to provide safety to those wagon trains, was it better to have a military escort the entire way, or to have posts along the way that could respond in within hours of a notification? And there are times in the Arctic where you may want to do convoys with a couple of icebreakers there in certain ice conditions. Sure. What's more likely to happen in the Arctic is it's a lot like a AAA tow truck on U.S. highways. I'm not sure what, I guess it's CAA in Canada, where if you get in trouble, you call a tow truck. And, I tell people that ice conditions are a little bit like flying from Anchorage to Valdez, Alaska. You can schedule yourself to be there by lunch, but if the fog doesn't clear, you'll probably make it by dinner. And the point here is this: international shipping companies want to work on a schedule. Those schedules are they try to vary start and stop down to the hour, actually, certainly down to the half day. And so the question is, and one of the issues that will come up in this Alaska or this US-based Federal Advisory Committee is what kind of resources do we need in a typical January as opposed to a typical June, because it's very different in terms of offering reliability for a shipper who wants to set a schedule. And until we think about those reliability issues, we can play any numbers game we want on the number of icebreakers. But the question is, how many do we need? And the interesting thing is this, is Chile has icebreakers. China has icebreakers.
Yeah.
Japan has icebreakers. Finland has icebreakers. We have lots of cooperation through something called the Arctic Icebreaker Coordinating Committee on Common Science. But the fact is, even though the Russians today require an escort, they finally kind of have reduced that for certain traffic, and you don't need continuously. It would be like traveling with a police escort. You don't need exactly that entire escort system the entire way. So that's what we want to figure out, because just as we have in the St. Lawrence Seaway, there's times that to get iron ore out of the port of Duluth to take to a steel mill in Germany, you need icebreakers, and there's times that you don't, and you can basically plan for it.
Yeah, you know what I would argue we need in addition in this vein is science. I'm biased, of course, but one of the big things is wind. So the warming climate is breaking up the sea ice, right? So instead of having huge chunks of ice that we either couldn't go through, needed an icebreaker to go through, or you had to sort of avoid and go around, we now have smaller chunks of ice flowing through the region. We can do a very good job of monitoring that, understanding that, and predicting the mobility of that ice. What we cannot do is understand the wind patterns. And it's actually unpredictable wind that is pushing that ice into certain regions, choking up certain parts of the Northwest Passage, which is unpredictable. So if we can get to a place where we can forecast wind, we'd be in a much better place.
Yeah, this actually ties into our question that we have about domestic research and science cooperation, which you guys have been touching upon. What do we already have in terms of the maritime research, and what are the gaps? So do we have a coordinated research structure in place to house accumulated data, baseline studies, and ultimately a sustained monitoring system for the Northwest Passage?
I mean, it's really easy to explain because the answer is no. To some extent, we definitely have lots of efforts and lots of nice individual efforts and lots of communication and conversation, but we don't have a coordinated approach the way that we should. And there's lots of initiatives right now at the level of Arctic Council, where, and the Arctic Observing System, and so at IASC, which is the International Arctic Science Committee, and they have the Arctic Observing Summit. We do that every year. We talk about it, but I would argue, in my experience, I've been involved for many years, I feel like we have the same conversation every year. We're making some progress. But I think we need to do this faster, because with AI and everything that's coming on board, we have to work together. The Alaskan Arctic is very, very different than the Canadian Arctic, which is very, very different than the Greenlandic area of the Arctic. But yet we are all connected. And so those three areas, we have to work together scientifically. And Arctic Pulse is a new initiative that's coming online, that's going to combine, U.S. resources with Canadian resources, hopefully with Greenlandic and Danish resources, but also with the Brits and mostly the Germans, to be honest, and the French, where we're going to be trying to bring in our scientific icebreakers to work together. Every summer we have science icebreakers in the Arctic. They're not just escorting and clearing paths. We're actually out there doing really important monitoring and science, but we do it separately. So the Germans bring in the Polar Stern and do the most amazing science through the Alfred Wegener Institute. The Canadians, we bring in the Amundsen. We do fantastic science. We have for 20 years. And often that science just gets, in silos.
I'm going to be slightly more optimistic, just real fast. When I started,
Good.
when I started on marine safety in the Arctic in the early '90s, actually it was more like the early '80s, but I was deputy minister, commissioner of environment in Alaska, and the Brer oil spill happened in the North Sea between and oiled the Shetland Islands, and there was no automatic identification system, AIS system, and we pushed at the IMO as a state to put a bell on the cat. And now there's not any major ship that isn't constantly reporting its position. So that gives us a lot of geomatics information, also can tell us, and we have kind of geofencing on our observing system at the Alaska Marine Exchange to tell us when ships are going slowly. So that's one piece of domain awareness. On the science side, we had a dust up when I was chair of the Arctic Research Commission between the United States and Canada, because a US company wanted to buy a Canadian ice satellite company. And the Canadian government rejected it. Nope, we can't have this. It's a challenge to Canadian sovereignty. It was we all smiled and said, okay. But the fact is, we now have a LiDAR satellite that was put in to look at glaciers, but it's much better at characterizing the ice constantly than we've had before. I mentioned sensors and fiber optics. We fought very early on, 25 years ago, to try to get more cabled observatories. And now it turns out that the cables coming into the Arctic are the observatories in some cases. So that's an improvement. We have much better telecommunications coming along, and new broader, I chair an advisory board for Iridium, which is the best 360 by 360 telecom capability, but our bandwidth is not as good as Starlink that's coming along, and this new Norwegian NATO work that will use a different satellite frequency as well. So we do have more infrastructure coming than we would like to give ourselves credit for. And the observing systems, the observing agreements are very important. What was said about wind is there. I guess I will say this. We've gone from struggling to justify infrastructure to now struggling to justify longer term funding for the observation programs that can use it. And there's been lots more of kind of on the ground truth testing for what we've got. And I appreciate the work of IASC. I appreciate the work of the International Polar Year. There's more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you say, I mean, I don't know if we're on different pages here, Mead, but I totally agree in terms of what we have. We've got so much information. It's information overload. And I'll use an analogy to, like you remember, do you remember about 20 years ago, you'd go to the grocery store and you really had a choice between cornflakes, Cheerios, and then Frosted Flakes, which your mom said, no, not today. Now you go to the grocery store. I mean, to pick a box of cereal is like overwhelming. And so I would just argue that's where we're at. AIS data, we now can get automatic information data to understand where ships are. We've been comparing there's about 7 different reliable places where you can get this satellite data and shore data based on ships. They're all different. The data says different things based on what data, what source of information that you get. Ships can also turn off their AIS, of course, which is always interesting to follow. But yes, but I would argue that we have, and I was arguing this recently at a parliamentary, I forget what parliamentary committee on the Arctic. We have so much, as you say, Mead, we've got so much going on and so much invested, but it's not coordinated by any stretch. So I would argue that where we're at now is we need to invest in coordination, because we will soon be overwhelmed in that aisle of cereal, and not know what to pick.
Yep. And I'm going to jump in maybe before you say, so do we have all this overlapping information just in Canada alone? And so do you feel that we need to be streamlined and organized and coordinated here in Canada, and then be able to then coordinate, internationally Arctic wise?
We could have been doing this podcast from the Ice Center in Iqaluit, where the United States, and there's one in Suitland, Maryland in the United States. And these two organizations in the United States, it's NOAA, the Coast Guard, and the Navy, together prepare an ice map every other day. And the Canadians prepare it every other day when we're not. There are operational building blocks right now to kind of get to the kind of coordination that you're talking about for the mariner, right? Think about it this way. We want to make sure that communities are aware of what's going on, which is one of the reasons why we push for AIS. We want to have operational support for the mariner, and we have that with the Coast Guards, but the Coast Guards now have much better information. I sat down for a long time with the National Weather Service here and said, here's the 5 products that I would like to see for our mariners that are better off, because the output from this National Ice Center in Suitland, in cooperation with the Iqaluit group, here is the National Weather Service in the United States. And they said, well, we're not sure if our priority right now is ice conditions for people who are going sealing in May in small boats, or your big boats. And I said, well, our big boats aren't here yet. Should be sure to take care of the small boats. But the fact is we've got to plan for these products. They're going to come along, and I think we'll have the coordination. But I'm just going to reiterate, we have had science cooperation aspects to understand climate change, and we've done a fairly good job on that over the last 30 years. The times I've been involved, I can tell you several ways we stitch things up.
So is this, are we talking baseline studies then? Is that what baseline studies are?
Baseline studies and understanding climate change, the Arctic's role in climate change, what's happening to sea ice, what's happening to multi-year ice, and so forth. And it's not to say we should diminish any of that part. We have had a very good process with AMSA and much more educated IMO work on the Arctic in terms of rules. The question on resources really comes down, among other things, to what product do we want? And again, this is where I would look at the St. Lawrence Seaway. The St. Lawrence Seaway, if you're a mariner and you're approaching the mouth of the St. Lawrence from the Atlantic Ocean, and you could be coming from Brazil, you could be coming from Germany, you could be coming from wherever, they're going to give you notices to mariners. Here's what's going on with the locks these days. Here's where we're doing repair. Here's where we are down one icebreaker for maintenance. Here's where there's a hazard that you need to think about. And that kind of, we're pushing for that sort of thing in the North Pacific and the Western Alaska part here, because it's a major part of prevention on marine casualty and oil spills. And that's where we need to go in the Arctic. So a group like the Alaska Marine Exchange, which is a private group, and these 2 ice centers are really big parts of the building blocks. I'm very optimistic, and I'll say this: the thing that most happens when I talk about this concept is the shipping companies will send somebody. There'll be somebody from Maersk on a panel that we had this spring say, we're not interested. And I say, you may not be interested, but no matter who shows up, I want to make sure it's safe. I want to make sure that there's a system of reliability. I want to make sure that there's enough understanding of what places to avoid. And I guarantee you that the Chinese now are reporting ice conditions regularly for their mariners for the Northeast Passage. Japanese maritime experts said to me recently that if you guys in North America actually move forward on this, it will help drive alternatives for China as opposed to relying totally on Russia. And I will leave you with this, because I think we're about to wrap up. I don't think it's in the security interests of Canada, the United States, NATO members. I don't think it's even in the security interest of of countries that we're having challenges with, like China right now, to have Russia have a monopoly on Arctic shipping services. That's why we have to think more about these products and the services and the science that informs them.
Yeah, and I think there's a big difference between operations and science. And I think we're a little further ahead on operations. And I love those examples because we have to cooperate in that regard. But I don't think we're cooperating to the extent that we should on the science, which we need to in order to get those products that are needed. So it's top 5 products. And I would argue wind forecasting is a big one. Pressured ice forecasting is another one. And, if we can get our science community working together the way that we get our operations together, I think we'll get there a lot faster.
Yeah, that's where I was thinking in terms of my question on that end, because now I'm understanding also the distinguishment between the two, because my understanding is we don't have a kind of a national, Arctic monitoring system in place. So we have certain baseline studies that have been done, and then we don't have a way to kind of continue.
Yeah, we do and we don't, right? Like we have, I would argue, everybody likes to pick on government, right? Everyone loves to. But I would argue that any science that's done in government is nice and is coordinated. So the Met Service, the Meteorological Service, like, the weather, not everything, but from a science, just like, I have a weather station. I have several weather stations. That data comes to me. I don't share it with anybody. My friend Brent Else from the University of Calgary, he's got 20 weather stations. Derek Mueller from Carleton, he's got 20 weather stations. They're not connected. But if they're coordinated through the federal government, then those stations are connected, and then there's an open data requirement. And I just think we, as scientists, need to be more willing to share so that we can, get to these places that we can get to. And I think we can do that through, for example, Arctic Pulse is going to push us to do that.
And also, Jessica, we have, for the lay listener here who's not been as immersed as much as the rest of us here, we have a U.S. Arctic Research Commission, a Canadian Polar Commission. They meet with some regularity to help set goals in that regard. We have the International Arctic
Polar
Science
Knowledge Canada.
I always tell people, don't leave your government alone, and I especially tell scientists this. You have to push for that coordination, and that's an important part of it. And sometimes when we've seen moves on our Arctic capabilities because industry is pushed for it. We had a big challenge. Again, I'll go back to cartography. The digital elevation model of the United States was done with the help of the Canadian arm on the space shuttle, but they didn't fly high enough latitude for Alaska and the Arctic to be mapped. So we brought the intelligence community, the security community together in the early 2010s to pay for that. So you just got to keep
you got to keep working together.
You got to keep moving
talking
things through. Yeah.
I'm gonna hand this over to Jaden now for a bit, because I actually think there's a whole nother component to this, and when it comes to cooperation and coordination on the science side.
Yeah, speaking on collaboration, Jackie, you work closely with northern communities on your research with Arctic Corridors Project. Can you tell us a bit more about that process and what key insights and concerns were shared by communities?
Yeah, it's been an amazing learning process, and I would argue I'm still learning. We're all still learning. But what I love about it is really two-way learning, So the process we used was we started in the community of Pond Inlet, and I've been working in Pond Inlet since about 2002. So it's a community that's near and dear to my heart. So it was easier to work there. And what we did was we just listened to the community tell us how they thought science should be done. I have expertise. I know how to look at satellite images. I know how to run models. What I don't know is where I should look, how I should do this. What questions should I be asking the models, and what kind of outputs should the models, be producing to make it useful? So what we did is we started by going to the schools, and so we worked with youth. I always thought, it's important to work with elders, and it is. We always work with elders. But actually, we're working more with youth now because there's this big disconnect, generational disconnect in communities where some elders don't even speak English and some youth don't speak Inuktitut. Now, we need to work on that, obviously, to ensure the preservation of language and culture. But youth are amazing, and so we would go and we would have youth train scientists. So grad students from the South would go up and we would have Inuit youth training us, on what questions should we be asking? How should we ask the questions? Words matter. And I never really thought about these things, and even as scientists, we tend to speak in sort of weird language. It's like a different language and we don't always communicate effectively. So we started with that. They taught us. And then we taught them a little bit about, how do you interpret a satellite image? How do you do GIS? Basic things. And then we worked together. And then what we did was the youth would then recruit hunters, fishers, any experts, elders, and then the youth would run workshops. So then us sort of Southern scientists, we were kind of out just hanging around the room. The youth would then work with their elders to identify significant maritime regions where they're observing impacts, where they're worried about the ships, etc. And so it was also a nice cultural exchange between the young and the elders, where they got to really talk about it. The elders got to share their knowledge with the youth. The youth got to lead, gain experience. And then we would map all of that digitally. And then we would send that back. And the youth, again, would share that with the community and make sure we got it right. So that's the approach that we took. And it was really, it blew my mind, and it's led to so much more. Now I've been trained and we've trained over almost 70 Inuit youth in Canada. We're trying to do this in Alaska as well. Just need the funding to do it. And it's just been amazing. And now those youth too have gone on to be hired by the Coast Guard or hired by other scientists to engage in different activities. Some of those youth have even gone to the IMO and spoken at the IMO with Lisa Hobakalik, who's the Canadian president of Inuit Circumpolar Council. So it's just, I've learned an enormous amount.
You argue it's definitely co-developed research?
Yeah, really co-developed research. We talk about co-developed research and we think that, it's enough just to go, okay, well, I'm going to take a sample here and I'm just going to ask these community members, Inuit, where I should take the sample, or I'm going to pay this Inuit person to be a bear guard while I do my science. No, that is not how we should be doing science moving forward. And for a long time, we talked about integrating natural science with traditional, or I should say Inuit or Indigenous knowledge. And what I've learned through talking to Inuit is that that's not how you think about it. It's not an integration. It's like both are valuable in different circumstances. And sometimes Indigenous knowledge isn't, the most useful knowledge set for this question. Other times it's the most. But I find where the magic is when you can figure out when to use which and when to use them together to try to get to the question. And like Mead mentioned before, what is the question we're trying to answer collectively? Where are we trying to get collectively? What is the success story of the Arctic? What does that look like? Because it looks very different to my, Inuit hunter friends in the Arctic than it might to, Senator Murkowski or Trudeau or whoever. So where do we want to go? I would say that's our biggest question, because the Arctic can look very different in the future depending on what decisions we make now.
I kind of have a question for Jaden. Jaden, you're young and from the region. Have you been involved in this?
Not too much directly up until I've been working with Arctic 360.
Okay. Well, I'll just tell you, besides what you're working on, Jackie, I'm also a member of the Explorers Club, and we actually gave an award recently to one of these youth programs doing ground truth, working with others through the Explorers Club. Adventure Canada also takes as many as 10 young explorers a year into the Northwest Passage, and not only with specialists in science, but in arts. My daughter went as an artist and came back a scientist.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
Adventure Canada is exactly who we work with on this project. So
yeah. And there's U.S. Fish and Wildlife sponsored Arctic Youth Ambassadors program out of here that we've got. I think it's very, very important to develop the capability over the long term, and so people understand you've got a career. Just think big picture. Where are we in history? How many times in human history have we had a chance to make the rules for a new ocean? And it's not that the Arctic Ocean hasn't been used for tens of thousands of years. It's that it's really a newly accessible ocean. We need an owner's manual for a new ocean. We need as owners and as responsible people to say, okay, here's what we're going to do it right. We know under international law, we can't tell people you can't come to the new ocean. We have done things to say, okay, we're not going to fish the Central Arctic. At the same time, we've said we'll carve up the bottom ownership of the new ocean, and we actually maybe foreclosed a little bit of science, and that was the impetus behind pushing for the science agreement. But I guess all I have to say is, as long as we keep talking about it and involve youth to begin with, we're going to have a cadre of people who know how to do what we're going to have to do for centuries going forward.
I couldn't agree more with that. And Jaden, it's so true. You guys are the future. And I feel like we are starting as a global community to understand that. And it is a new Arctic, but it's also it is a new Arctic Ocean, but it's also an old Arctic Ocean. Inuit use the phrase that sea ice is our highway. Well, that's just changing. The highway is changing. And so to exclude Inuit or to exclude youth from that conversation is ludicrous. It's just insanity. And I totally agree. It's like for us in the South, it feels like a blank canvas, this new open area where, for people whose homeland is the North, this is not, it's changing, but it's not new. So how we speak about the region is also so important. And that is something I've been learning. And I mess up all the time because of my positionality, my perspective as a Southerner, but it's also exciting. I'm going to take some optimism from you, Mead. Usually it's me that's optimistic. This is, and say we have this opportunity to do it right. We don't have to repeat the mistakes of our past. We can create this self-determined, sustainable ocean ecosystem that we understand and that we protect in an appropriate way, but that serves us from an economic perspective and a geopolitical perspective. We have that opportunity.
Jackie, I think you hit on something interesting when we are talking about how we used to talk to elders. Now we still talk to the elders, but we really talk to the youth. And I think it's there that we're talking about just, we need to understand the history. We need to understand the context and the whole historical bedrock of which everything is moving forward today. But it's also in the youth, because also the youth are the ones who have grown up. Even if they're remote and don't have access to great internet, they are tech savvy. And Jaden's a perfect example. I was talking in the last episode. And so they understand, they already live in both worlds, and much better than, older people anywhere. and so in that sense, I think there's a lot to say about the role that they're going to play going forward. We should never downplay the fact that they're integral to what we're doing. I know that we're going for, quite some time now, and I don't want to take up too much of everyone's time. So maybe, and speaking of optimism and Mead, your optimism, Jackie, I'll give you more of an opportunity here to do some more optimistic discussion. But I guess we could say, overall, I'm listening to this, and it's, we could say it's complicated times. There's a lot of uncertainty, but we're also in a really big period of change. And with that, there is a ton of room for collaboration, a lot of room for potential. And like you said, Mead, we just need to keep talking about these issues. And I think it's by bringing the right people like you both, together to kind of really start then talking through, well, what are we talking about? What does this mean? How do we collaborate more? What do we need to do then to cooperate better? How do we build then? We need an owner's manual. How do we build it? So what's step one and that we need to do, and where do we sit down and how do we start writing that? And then how do we get those resources to be able to do that? So if I could just end on one quick question, it's like just a bullet answer. If there's one thing that you're most optimistic about, what would that be? And if there was one urgent thing you'd say, like, okay, if we're going to sit down today, this is the one thing that we need to do to get ourselves moving and be more cooperative.
I'm just going to say, I'm even juiced by this conversation where there's an understanding that we need resources more than new rules. And what you're doing in the Corridors Project is, to me, more resources than rules necessarily. It's going to help us understand how to do it right. If we can figure out ways to pay the bill, okay. Canada charges for search and rescue from the North Pole. The U.S. Coast Guard doesn't. We have differing philosophies on different ways to pay the bill. But if we can figure out the way to pay the bill, I believe we can have safe, secure, reliable Arctic shipping. And I'll even add the word sustainable. And it's going to help sustain life in the Arctic many different ways.
I mean, it's so much we need to do, but if I'm going to be succinct, it's absolutely cooperation, working together, and scientists working together, private sector working together, government working together towards similar goals. And in Canada in particular, I would say we don't have an Arctic ambassador. I think that the US is leading in that regard.
Well, we have one who hasn't been confirmed as yet, but yes.
That's true. I would love for us to go that route and to put a little more emphasis on the Arctic instead of using the Arctic as a political sort of ping pong ball where, the Harper government was focused on the Arctic. So maybe the Trudeau government couldn't be as much. So we focused on the Arctic in certain ways, but not others. I would really like to see bipartisan cooperation in the Arctic, and we need like-minded countries to be working together in the Arctic.
I couldn't agree more. Jaden, Nicole, Nadia, thank you so much. I think I'm just going to put this out there. Let's carry this conversation over to our conference in February, our Arctic 360 annual conference, and put together a nice session and see how we take everything we've discussed and what we learned and what we know we need to do and figure out how to move that forward. So I thank you both.
As a reminder, the views expressed on this podcast are the views of the participants alone and do not represent the views or opinions of Arctic 360, the Monk School Global Affairs, or any other government or agency. Well, that's it for now. Thank you for listening to Breaking the Ice. Follow Arctic 360 on social media to stay up to date on the latest podcast episodes and Arctic 360 content. You can find us on all streaming platforms, LinkedIn and Twitter, or you can visit our website at arctic360.org. Thank you for listening. This is Breaking the Ice.